This video is going to be on something called the Big History Project. It's something I'm very excited about because it has multiple uses, I think, for AP World History and just for teaching in general. The Big History Project, as I'll explain as we go further into it, really has a big scale and scope focus. My thesis for this and my big argument is that the Big History Project is so important because it opens up huge questions that allow the students really to delve into interdisciplinary issues and then to ask questions of significance that are thematic to the course and really get the students to think about why they're doing history in the first place. The founders of Big History included the following people. One of the most important people is a man named David Christian. You'll be watching a video, if you haven't already, that I posted where David Christian gave a talk on Big History at TED Talks, where he talks about why he came up with this idea and why he was teaching it. David Christian has probably been one of the most important intellectual founders to the idea of the Big History Project. Another guy that I just came into contact with is a man named Bob Bain. Bob Bain is both a history teacher and an educator on teaching himself. Later on in this video, I'm going to explain one of his big arguments that I find to be extremely important for Big History, and I think foundational to AP World History itself. Bob Bain really stresses the importance of teaching a scope and scale to the AP World History course, and that really comes in with Big History. Last up is Bill Gates. Most of you, I'm sure, are very familiar, and I know he's somewhat controversial these days in the educational field. Bill Gates has really been pushing through a lot of funding for big, new, innovative projects, and he was a big funder behind the idea of Big History, which I know can be a little bit controversial with Bill Gates, but I think if you delve deeper into Big History, the important part of it is really getting students to ask these big questions that are significant and global in nature. So what is the big issue with Big History? Well, actually, Big History can kind of be analogized to the issue of a fairy tale called Goldilocks. And we all know the story of Goldilocks. Goldilocks goes into the house and finds porridge, and the porridge is either too hot, too cold, or just about right. This actually is sort of one of the foundational principles to the idea of Big History. So how does that come in? Well, here are the themes. So the big question that we have is, what does it mean to be a human being in AP World History? How do we really talk about that? And David Christian really brings up this idea of critical thresholds, and he has 9 of them. According to his argument, there are 9 periods in world history where conditions kind of meld together and everything comes together and kind of overflows into this. This is a really important concept, I think, with the students. This gets into the notion of cause and effect, but not their typical notion. I think most students enter into the room with something known as monocausal notions of cause and effect, the idea that one cause leads to one effect, and we know that that's not really what happens. In fact, we have some other terms that go along with this in the social sciences and natural sciences. And the idea is that so many different causes come together that eventually an event becomes what we call overdetermined, meaning there are so many events that have come forward that we finally reach a critical threshold, a point in which we cannot turn back. And this brings up another point that's brought up in AP environmental science, known as the tipping point. So we reach this point in which multiple causes are coming together, some event is overdetermined, and then some tipping point throws us over. I like to go into this, for example, with my students in World War I. Most of the students think that the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand is the cause of World War I, and I always explain to them, no, that is really that tipping point, but behind the tipping point are numerous other critical thresholds, overdeterminations that happen. So this comes out in Big History, and I think makes it easier to explain that to the students. Another issue that comes up in Big History is the notion of complexity. Just for the students to be able to see how many different thresholds there are and how they come together and how human beings are so interlocked and interdependent with natural causes that take place. And that complexity is taking place everywhere from physics to biology to chemistry to history to our notions of significance. This means that the Big History Project is an interdisciplinary project. And people who teach Big History, there are actually some classes that are entirely Big History classes, will actually work in interdisciplinary groups with people from other departments, from physics departments, chemistry, biology, and then history, in order to create a deeper understanding for students on how to do Big History. But this is where we come up with this issue of, what does it mean to be a human being? And obviously, there are a lot of different definitions we can give to this. For some people, we look to philosophy. For other people, we look to theology to explain this. Big History attempts to find some way to merge all these together and to explain this. And so for Big History, what makes human beings unique in our interdisciplinary and in our interlocking relationships is something known as collective learning. The idea that we as human beings can pass on to future generations what we have learned about, both on a practical level and an ethical level. And collective learning really is probably like the most structural and key issue that drives human development within history. And the idea is that we have the ability to use language in order to push collective learning into future generations. So, what about these critical thresholds? Well, the critical thresholds are a culmination of events that lead into changes. And probably one of the most important that starts up the class is the Big Bang. This notion that all of a sudden, when there is nothing, we get something. And that actually is a huge question in big history. How is that possible? I mean, if we think about it right now, there really is nothing that I can think of that just pops into being from nothing. There always has to be something that pops into being. And so how do we get this big bang, this motion, this point that happens? And there's so many issues that can come out of this, I think, that you can talk about with students that they don't realize. Things that we just take for granted, like time and space and the connection of time and space, all come out of this. Basically, the analogy is a funnel that takes place with the Big Bang. And the reason why I think this becomes so important in teaching history is to bring up for the students the issues of contingency and agency. So contingency being that oftentimes when humans have acted within society, we focus in on those human actions, those human choices, and yet so often it's contingent. It's based upon all the circumstances that are surrounding people at that time period. At the same time, it's important not to lose agency, to be able to see that human beings do have the ability to choose. And even though we are acting within this world of contingency, these circumstances that kind of build up and create massive changes, we also make choices that shape those changes. And so that becomes this tension throughout big history and throughout AP world history as well, is that how do we explain the effects of context and our ability to mold context? And how do we find some way to resolve that tension? And that gets us to collective learning that I was talking about before. And this is one of the big things about big history. And it really, with collective learning, it's really about language. And this is what, according to big history, makes us so unique. Now, you might be saying right now, well, my students bring up, and you might even believe, hey, animals can communicate with each other, right? I mean, we know of different ways in which dolphins or whales or other types of mammals or other types of animals have very complex ways of communicating with one another. However, what big history would argue is that there's a little bit of a difference. While it is true that different types of animal groups can communicate with each other, they definitely display emotions with each other. They display an ability to raise their young. They display an ability to have leadership, to have followers. They display a lot of these practical as well as group dynamics. The difference with human beings is that we pass on information through language. And the information we pass on is both practical and abstract. And that shared information, according to big history, is what makes us different, because it allows us to build up experience. It allows us to share with future generations the lessons that we have learned from the past. Now, I know you might be thinking, oh, here comes that typical cliche, right? History teaches us how to solve problems of the past. Recently, I heard that guy that I brought up, Bob Bain, made an argument that I completely agree with, where he said, if it was really true that historians could solve problems by looking to the past, then we would be millionaires. That's not why we study history. We know that there are different contexts, there are different contingencies from the past. It is not so easy to just solve problems by looking at the past. But what language does allow us to do is that language allows us to see the mistakes that we have made in the past and apply the lessons, apply the parallels to today that don't really solve our problems, but allow us to build upon that foundation in order to create sort of a practical level of progress over time. So, what are the critical questions then that we get from big history? Well, one of the big ones that we can ask students is, how did we get here? And I know it sounds so fundamentally simple. And you might even get students who might say something like, evolution, or there might be some very theological students in the room who might bring up a theological answer. But this brings up some really complex questions. How do we get something from nothing? And how do we explain 14 billion years that have led up to human development? And that really does lead us into that question. How do you get something from nothing? If you really think about it, and this comes up in Big History, there is nothing else that we can point to that comes out of nothing. Like right now, I would love to be eating a cheeseburger right now, but the more and more I think about eating a cheeseburger, it is not just going to appear before me. I have to go get it. And obviously the cheeseburger is going to come from other elements. So how did we get this universe that blew into existence and over 14 billion years developed? Big question again that we've talked about here is, what makes humans unique? Or are we just interconnected with the rest of nature? Is there no difference between us and the rest of nature? And whichever way you come down on those questions, there are some huge implications to that as to what that means. Obviously, you can think right now, whichever way you come down on that, what does this mean for our stewardship of nature as well? Or what does it mean for us being connected to the rest of nature and ecology? And then last up, of course, is the biggest question of all. What is the significance for our existence in the end? Why are we here? And how does that impact the way that we establish societies? So this brings us back to a methodological question about teaching itself. And it gets into that guy I was talking about, Bob Bain. Bob Bain gave a lecture very recently that I got to hear at the AP World History reading. And he talked about the difference between what he called truffle hunters and storytellers. He said, look, what are we as teachers in the classroom? Are we truffle hunters, meaning are we looking into getting all the details and individual elements of history? Or are we storytellers, trying to look at the big picture and trying to give students a sense of the big picture? He said, you know something? We're both. We have to do both. It is impossible to escape both. There's been a long trend in history in general in the last 30 years for us to look at primary source documentation and say, we want our students to be like professional historians. If you think about that, there are some real problems with that. The students we teach are high school students. They have very limited frameworks to work from. They are still maturing. They don't really understand all of the contrasting big pictures that historians have argued about for a long time. At the same time, we don't want to just brainwash students into thinking, okay, here's the framework that explains history and there's no alternative. We want them to challenge that. So when we really think about it, history in our high school classrooms is the beginning. It's not the end, it's the beginning of teaching students this constant back and forth. Learn the story and then challenge the story with the details. Then go back to those details and challenge them with a new story. And keep going back and forth in developing a much more mature, nuanced sense of what this story is all about. So, how do we incorporate what we are teaching here with Big History? I think there are some really big issues that we can incorporate into this. One, a philosophical issue known as epistemology. How do we know what we know? This is a great time to be able to incorporate this into the scientific and religious reformations. And there's some really good places at the Big History website that get into the scientific revolution and how science changed the way we thought about things, but how science is itself a continuously evolving process that really does not provide just absolute answers where we just know the truth. Ontology. What is the nature of our being? How do we interact with nature? Think about how this could be applied so easily at the beginning of our classes, talking about how river systems and deserts and lack of land influence the creation of society. We can also talk about it at the end of our class with the issue of global warming, whether or not it's happening, how we might be causing it, how we might not be causing it, what it means for our future. All these things could be huge debates within our classroom. Interconnections and thresholds. Think about how most of our class in AP World History is about international trade issues and how information goes back and forth. We begin the class with that, with the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean and the Andes Mountains, and we finish the class with globalization. All of these things demonstrate again and again how language and how the interconnection between people is so important. So In my opinion, big history is a great way to bracket this class, to provide some huge questions that the kids can get into. And now it's just a question of how we incorporate this in, how we integrate big history. I hope this is helpful for you, and I hope this is going to give you in this last week that we're together a good way to really think about some of the significant issues you can bring into your AP World History class and really deepen it and make it more thematic. Thanks a lot.